In the quiet moments between our racing thoughts, in the space where breath meets stillness, something profound awaits. Tonight, we embark on a journey that has transformed countless lives across 25 centuries. These are not mere bedtime stories. They are keys to unlocking the deepest peace your heart has ever known. What you're about to experience is something extraordinary. 3 hours of the most powerful Buddhist tales ever told, each one carefully chosen not just to calm your mind, but to fundamentally shift how you see yourself and the world around you. These ancient stories carry within them secrets that monks have whispered in candlelit halls, wisdom that has guided emperors and peasants alike toward unshakable tranquility. But here's what makes tonight different from every other meditation or mindfulness practice you've tried. These aren't abstract concepts or breathing exercises. They're living stories that will work on you while you listen, dissolving years of accumulated stress, anxiety, and inner turmoil without you even realizing it's happening. Think of this as spiritual medicine delivered through the most beautiful storytelling tradition humanity has ever created. I need to tell you something important. Over the past decade, I've studied with meditation masters across 3 continents, spent months in silent retreat, and explored every form of spiritual practice imaginable. Yet nothing, absolutely nothing, has transformed my relationship with peace more profoundly than the practice of receiving these sacred tales. They work on a level deeper than the thinking mind, bypassing our mental resistance and planting seeds of wisdom directly into our consciousness. Tonight, you'll discover why the Buddha himself chose stories as his primary teaching method, why these particular narratives have survived wars, cultural upheavals, and the passage of centuries to reach you in this moment, and most importantly, how they can begin rewiring your nervous system for calm, clarity, and unshakable inner peace starting right now. Here's what we'll explore together. First, the tale of the monk who found enlightenment in his greatest failure, showing you how your deepest struggles might actually be doorways to breakthrough. Then, the merchant whose impossible journey revealed the secret that dissolves all anxiety about the future. We'll encounter the master who taught through silence more powerfully than words ever could, and the student whose confusion became his greatest teacher. Each story builds upon the last, creating a tapestry of understanding that will shift something fundamental in how you experience life. By the end of our time together, you'll possess practical wisdom that you can carry into tomorrow's challenges, next week's uncertainties, and all the years ahead. This isn't just about feeling better for an evening. This is about fundamentally transforming your relationship with peace itself. But before we begin, I want you to understand something that most people miss about Buddhist wisdom. These stories aren't asking you to become someone different. They're not demanding that you abandon your beliefs, change your lifestyle, or adopt new practices. Instead, they're gentle mirrors that reflect back the peace that has always been your birthright, the calm that exists beneath even your most turbulent thoughts. The Buddha once said that we suffer not because life is difficult, but because we resist life's natural flow. Tonight's stories will show you what it means to stop swimming against the current and discover the profound rest that comes from learning to float. This isn't passive resignation. It's the most active, intelligent response to life's challenges you can imagine. Now, settle in completely. Let your body find its natural resting position. Allow your breathing to slow and deepen on its own. What you're about to receive has been a sacred trust passed down through generations of awakened beings, each one adding their own understanding to these timeless truths. our first tale takes us to the mountains of ancient Tibet, where a young monk named Tenzin believed his spiritual journey had ended in complete disgrace. Little did he know that his apparent failure would become the very foundation of his awakening. The monk who found gold in his ashes, high in the windswept mountains, where the air grew thin and prayer flags danced against impossible blue skies. The monastery of Gandenling had stood for 7 centuries. Its walls had witnessed the footsteps of countless seekers, the whispered prayers of devoted monks, and the profound silences that only come when human beings touch something greater than themselves. Among the newest arrivals was Tenzin, a young man whose sincerity burned as brightly as the butter lamps that flickered in the prayer hall. He had come to the monastery carrying nothing but a worn traveling bag and a heart full of desperate hope. His village had been consumed by drought, his family scattered by hardship, and in his darkest hour, he had heard of the peace that could be found in these sacred halls. Tenzin threw himself into monastic life with the intensity of someone trying to outrun his own suffering. He rose before dawn for meditation, memorized sutras with fierce dedication, and approached every teaching as if his very life depended on understanding it completely. His fellow monks admired his commitment, though some whispered that perhaps he was trying too hard, gripping the path like a drowning man grips driftwood. The head monk, Lama Norbu, watched Tenzin's efforts with the patient eyes of someone who had seen this pattern many times before. During their private meetings, he would gently suggest that spiritual progress couldn't be forced, that enlightenment was more like allowing than achieving. But Tenzin, consumed by his need to transform his suffering into something meaningful, heard these words as encouragement to try even harder. Months passed. While other monks seemed to find natural ease in their practice, Tenzin struggled with racing thoughts during meditation, felt his heart clench with frustration when his mind wandered, and began to believe that perhaps he was fundamentally flawed, incapable of the peace that seemed to come so naturally to others. The annual festival of Losar approached, bringing with it the most important ceremony in the monastery's calendar. For this sacred celebration, one monk would be chosen to tend the eternal flame that burned at the heart of the temple, ensuring it never died throughout the 3 days of observance. This was considered the highest honor, reserved for someone whose practice had demonstrated genuine spiritual maturity. Tenzin had secretly hoped he might be chosen, not from pride, but from a desperate need to prove to himself that his struggles had meaning. When Lama Norbu announced that the honor would go to Geshe Palden, a monk of quiet wisdom and natural grace, Tenzin felt his heart crack with disappointment. Still, he resolved to support the ceremony with every ounce of devotion he could muster. The festival began with the haunting sounds of long horns echoing across the valley, calling the faithful to witness the lighting of the sacred flame. The entire community gathered in the main hall as Geshe Palden performed the ancient ritual, kindling the fire that would burn continuously for the next 3 days. The flame caught beautifully, dancing upward with golden light that seemed to embody the joy and reverence filling every heart present. But on the second night, disaster struck. A sudden windstorm tore through the mountains with unprecedented fury. Ancient windows rattled in their frames, and despite everyone's careful attention, a fierce gust found its way into the temple hall. In one terrible moment, the eternal flame was extinguished. The sacred fire that was never supposed to die had been snuffed out during the most holy celebration of the year. The monastery fell into shocked silence. This had never happened in living memory. The monks gathered in emergency council, their faces grave with concern. Some spoke in whispers about bad omens, others about the need to begin the entire ceremony again. In the midst of this crisis, Geshe Palden approached Lama Norbu with tears streaming down his weathered face. "Lamala," he said, his voice breaking, "I have failed in the most fundamental way. I was entrusted with the sacred flame, and I have allowed it to die. I am not worthy to continue serving in this capacity. Please, choose someone else to relight the fire and complete the ceremony." Before Lama Norbu could respond, Tenzin stepped forward. His heart was pounding, but something deeper than fear or ambition was moving him now. "Lamala," he said quietly, "if I may, I would like to offer myself for this task." A murmur rippled through the assembled monks. Tenzin was still considered junior, his practice unpolished, his understanding incomplete by most measures. Several senior monks exchanged glances that clearly questioned this young man's readiness for such a crucial responsibility. But Lama Norbu looked into Tenzin's eyes and saw something that perhaps others had missed. "And why do you feel called to this service?" he asked. Ji's voice was steady despite the tremently. Tenzin's bling in his hands. "Because I know what it's like for the flame to go out. I know what it's like to fail, to feel darkness where there should be light. If someone who understands darkness can rekindle the flame, perhaps that flame will burn with a different kind of strength." The hall fell completely silent. Even the wind seemed to pause in its howling. Lama Norbu studied Tenzin for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "Light the flame," he said simply. Tenzin approached the altar where the extinguished lamp sat cold and still. As he knelt before it, something remarkable happened. All his months of struggle, all his feelings of inadequacy, all his desperate grasping for spiritual achievement suddenly felt different. He wasn't lighting this flame to prove anything to anyone, including himself. He was lighting it because a light was needed, and he happened to be the one holding the match. His hands moved with surprising steadiness as he prepared the wick and struck the flint. The small flame caught immediately, dancing upward with a clarity and brightness that seemed even more beautiful than the original fire. But what happened next would be spoken of in the monastery for generations to come. As Tenzin remained kneeling before the rekindled flame, his whole body began to relax in a way it never had before. The desperate striving that had driven him for months simply dissolved. His racing mind grew still, not through effort, but through a kind of natural settling, like muddy water becoming clear when left undisturbed. In that moment of complete surrender to what was actually needed, rather than what he thought he needed to accomplish, enlightenment bloomed in his consciousness like a lotus opening to sunlight. He remained in that position for nearly an hour, tears streaming down his face, not from sadness, but from a joy so profound it seemed to encompass everything he had ever experienced. When he finally stood and turned to face the assembled community, every monk present could see that something fundamental had shifted. The young man who had been trying so hard to find peace had become peace itself. Later, as the festival concluded with the flame burning steadily through its final night, Lama Norbu sat with Tenzin in the quiet of his chambers. "Tell me," the old teacher said with a gentle smile, "what did you discover in that moment?" Tenzin was quiet for a long time, watching the play of shadows on the wall. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a quality of settled knowing that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than his 24 years. "I discovered that the flame never really goes out," he said. "When the lamp was extinguished, I thought the light was gone. But the capacity for light was always there, waiting. The darkness wasn't the opposite of light, It was just light waiting to remember itself. And all my struggling, all my trying to become someone worthy of tending the flame. I was already the flame. I just hadn't recognized it yet. The old Lama nodded slowly. And what about failure? What about the times when the light seems truly lost? Tenzin smiled with the kind of peace that can only come from having touched the bottom of despair and found solid ground there. Failure is just the flame teaching us how to burn more brightly. Every time we think we've lost the light, we discover that the light was never dependent on our ability to maintain it perfectly. It just needs our willingness to begin again. From that night forward, Tenzin became known not as the monk who saved the ceremony, but as the teacher who helped others find the flame that burns within their own hearts. His story spread beyond the monastery walls, carried by travelers and pilgrims who had witnessed the transformation that happened when someone stops trying to become peaceful and simply allows the peace that was always there to reveal itself. But this was only the beginning of Tenzin's understanding. In the months that followed, he would discover that enlightenment wasn't a destination, but a way of moving through life. Not an achievement, but a continuous opening to what each moment was offering. The flame he had lit that night became a metaphor for something much deeper. The recognition that our greatest struggles often prepare us to serve others in ways we could never have imagined. Years later, when students would come to him with their own struggles, their own sense of spiritual failure, Tenzin would share a practice that had grown from his experience that night. He would light a small candle and then deliberately blow it out in front of them, watching their faces as the smoke curled upward in the darkness. "Now," he would say gently, "where did the light go?" Most would stare at the extinguished wick, confused by the question. Some would speak of the light being gone, destroyed, lost forever. Others might mention that it existed only in their memory now. But eventually, someone would realize what Tenzin was pointing toward. "The light didn't go anywhere," they would say with dawning recognition. "The capacity for light is still here. It just needs to be rekindled." "Exactly," Tenzin would smile, striking a match and bringing the flame back to life. And what does this teach us about our own inner flame when life's storms seem to extinguish it? This simple demonstration became known throughout the region as the teaching of the eternal flame. It helped countless people understand that spiritual awakening isn't about maintaining perfect conditions, but about recognizing the indestructible nature of awareness itself. No matter how dark things become, no matter how lost we feel, the essential light of consciousness remains untouched, waiting only for the right conditions to shine forth again. The Merchant's Impossible Journey. Our next tale carries us from the mountain monasteries to the bustling trade routes of ancient China, where a silk merchant named Wei Liang was about to discover that the most valuable treasures cannot be bought, sold, or stolen. Wei Liang had built his reputation on the impossible. While other merchants followed well-established routes between major cities, he specialized in finding paths that others deemed too dangerous, too uncertain, or simply too difficult to navigate. His caravans carried the finest silks from the southern provinces to the northern capitals, crossing mountain passes that claimed weaker men and their fortunes with ruthless regularity. But Wei Liang possessed something that set him apart from his competitors, an absolute trust in his ability to adapt to whatever challenges arose. Where others saw insurmountable obstacles, he saw puzzles to be solved. Where they feared the unknown, he found opportunity. This confidence had made him wealthy beyond most people's dreams. But it had also created a subtle prison he didn't yet recognize. The journey that would change everything began with what appeared to be his greatest opportunity yet. The emperor's court had commissioned a delivery of the rarest golden silk, woven by master craftsmen in the far south, to be transported to the capital in time for the New Year celebrations. The payment offered was enough to secure Wei Liang's family's prosperity for generations, but the timeline was impossibly tight. Even under perfect conditions, the journey would take every available day, leaving no margin for delays, detours, or difficulties. Every other merchant had declined the commission, deeming it too risky. But Wei Liang saw only the challenge and the reward. He assembled his strongest team, purchased the finest pack animals, and planned his route with meticulous precision. Nothing would be left to chance. Every contingency had been considered, every potential problem anticipated and prepared for. The first week of travel proceeded exactly as planned. The caravan made excellent time. The weather held fair, and Wei Liang felt the familiar satisfaction of watching his careful preparations unfold smoothly. His confidence grew with each mile covered, each obstacle successfully navigated. At this pace, they would reach the capital with days to spare. But on the 8th morning, they crested a ridge to find their carefully planned route completely blocked. A massive rock slide, triggered by recent rains, had obliterated the mountain pass that was crucial to their timeline. Boulders the size of houses lay scattered across what had been a navigable trail, creating a barrier that would take weeks to clear even with a large crew. Wei Liang stared at the devastation, his mind immediately calculating alternatives. There were other routes, but they would add at least 10 days to the journey, making it impossible to meet the deadline. The commission would be forfeit, his reputation damaged, and the substantial expenses of the expedition would come directly from his family's savings. For the first time in his career, Wei Liang felt something he had never experienced before: complete helplessness in the face of circumstances beyond his control. All his planning, all his preparation, all his confidence meant nothing when confronted with the simple reality of 10,000 tons of rock blocking his path. His team looked to him for leadership, for the creative solution he had always managed to find in the past. But as hours passed and he explored every possible option, the truth became undeniable. There was no way forward. The journey, as originally conceived, was impossible. As evening fell and the caravan made camp in the shadow of the blocked pass, Wei Liang found himself sitting alone, staring up at stars that seemed to mock his predicament. For the first time in years, he felt truly small, truly powerless. All his success had been built on the belief that human ingenuity and determination could overcome any obstacle. Now, faced with a challenge that no amount of cleverness could solve, he didn't know who he was anymore. It was then that he noticed an old man sitting by a small fire some distance from the main camp. Wei Liang had seen him earlier, one of the local villagers who sometimes guided travelers through the region, but had paid him little attention. Now, with nowhere else to turn, he found himself drawn to the stranger's quiet presence. "Difficult situation," the old man said without preamble as Wei Liang approached. His voice carried no judgment, no false sympathy, just simple acknowledgement of what was true. "Impossible situation," Wei Liang corrected, his voice heavy with defeat. 20 years of building a reputation, and it ends with a pile of rocks I can't move." The old man gestured for Wei Liang to sit beside the fire. "Tell me about this impossible situation," he said, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. Wei Liang found himself pouring out the entire story: the commission, the timeline, the blocked pass, the financial and professional disaster that awaited him. As he spoke, he realized he was looking for sympathy, for someone to acknowledge the unfairness of his predicament. But the old man simply listened with the kind of complete attention that Wei Liang had rarely experienced. When the merchant finished his tale, the old man was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he asked a question that seemed to come from an entirely different conversation. "In all your years of trading, what has brought you the greatest joy?" Wei Liang blinked, confused by the apparent irrelevance of the question. "Joy? I suppose it's been the success, the satisfaction of completing impossible journeys, of delivering goods that others said couldn't be delivered. And what made those journeys possible? Planning, preparation, determination." Wei Liang began, but the old man held up a gentle hand. "Before all of that, what made the journeys possible at the very beginning?" Wei Liang struggled with the question, sensing that something important lay hidden in its simplicity. I don't understand." The old man smiled and pointed up at the star-filled sky. "The merchant who looks only at his destination never sees the beauty of the path. The trader who focuses only on profit never discovers the treasures that cannot be bought or sold. Tell me, in all your successful journeys, what did you learn about yourself that you could never have discovered sitting safely at home?" As the question settled into Wei Liang's consciousness, something began to shift. He thought about the harsh mountain passes that had taught him endurance he didn't know he possessed, the storms that had revealed his capacity for calm leadership when others panicked, the moments of danger that had shown him depths of courage he had never suspected existed within him. "The journeys taught me who I am," he said slowly, the realization dawning like sunrise. "Not just who I thought I was, but who I actually am when everything is on the line." The old man nodded. "And what is this blocked past teaching you about who you are?" The question hit Wei Liang like a physical force. For hours, he had been focused on what the rock slide was preventing him from doing, from achieving, from becoming. He had never considered what it might be revealing about his true nature when stripped of all his usual resources and strategies. "It's teaching me that I am not my successes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's showing me that beneath all my confidence and planning, there's something that doesn't depend on getting what I want or avoiding what I fear." "What is that something?" Wei Liang sat in silence, feeling into the question with his whole being. Gradually, he became aware of something he had never noticed before, a quality of awareness that remained steady whether he was succeeding or failing, whether his plans were working or crumbling. It wasn't affected by external circumstances, didn't fluctuate with his fortunes, didn't depend on his ability to solve problems or overcome obstacles. "It's awareness itself," he said with growing wonder. "The part of me that knows I'm disappointed, but isn't itself disappointed. The part that observes my fear without being afraid. It's been there all along, but I never paid attention to it because I was so focused on managing my external world." The old man's smile deepened. "And what would happen to your journey if you traveled from that place of awareness rather than from the place of needing to control outcomes?" The question opened something in Wei Liang's chest that felt like a door he hadn't known was locked. What if the purpose of the journey wasn't to deliver silk, but to discover this unshakable awareness? What if every challenge was an invitation to touch this deeper stability rather than an obstacle to be overcome? The journey would become impossible to fail, he said, his voice filled with amazement, because its real purpose wouldn't depend on external circumstances. They sat together in comfortable silence as this understanding settled into Wei Liang's bones. Around them, the night sounds of the mountains continued their ancient rhythm, indifferent to human plans and disappointments. But instead of feeling small in the face of nature's vastness, Wei Liang felt held by something infinitely larger and more reliable than his own efforts. "What should I do about the commission?" he finally asked. The old man chuckled softly. "What feels most aligned with this awareness you've discovered?" Wei Liang considered the question from this new perspective. The old Wei Liang would have been frantically searching for alternative routes, pushing his team beyond their limits, or perhaps even attempting the dangerous process of clearing the rockslide himself. But from this place of deeper knowing, a different response emerged. I think I need to return to the capital and explain the situation honestly, accept whatever consequences come, and trust that this awareness I've touched will guide me toward whatever comes next." "And the silk?" Wei Liang looked toward his caravan, where the precious cargo lay carefully protected. "The silk was never really mine to begin with. It belongs to whoever needs it most. Perhaps there's someone along our return route who would benefit from these beautiful fabrics more than the emperor's court." Over the following days, as the caravan retraced its path toward home, Wei Liang discovered that traveling from awareness rather than anxiety created an entirely different experience. Instead of rushing desperately toward a goal, he found himself noticing details that had escaped him on the outward journey. The way morning light caught on dewdrops, the patient dignity of the pack animals, the quiet wisdom in his team's weathered faces. More remarkably, opportunities began presenting themselves that he had been too focused to see before. In one village, they encountered a family preparing for their daughter's wedding who had never seen silk of such quality. The joy on their faces when Wei Liang offered to sell them enough fabric for a wedding dress at cost was worth more to him than any imperial payment could have been. In another town, they met a group of monks whose temple had been damaged in a fire. The silk that Wei Liang freely donated for new ceremonial robes created a connection that would bring him far more business in the years to come than any single commission ever could. By the time they reached the capital, Wei Liang had sold or given away nearly half the silk, each transaction flowing naturally from the awareness that had been awakened by the blocked pass. When he stood before the emperor's treasurer to explain his failure to complete the commission, he felt no anxiety, no desperate need to justify himself. He simply told the truth about what had happened and what he had learned. To his amazement, the treasurer listened with growing interest rather than anger, telling me, "So your Wei Liang finished his official said-when account that a blocked mountain pass taught you something about the nature of awareness itself?" "It sounds strange when put that way," Wei Liang admitted. "But yes, it showed me that peace doesn't come from successfully controlling circumstances, but from discovering the part of myself that remains untroubled regardless of what happens." The treasurer was quiet for a long moment, studying Wei Liang's face. Finally, he smiled. "You know, I've been looking for someone to handle a different kind of commission. We need someone who can travel to the remote provinces not to deliver goods, but to learn about the wisdom traditions of various regions and report back on what practices might benefit the court. It requires someone who understands that the most valuable discoveries often come through apparent failures. Would you be interested?" This new role would eventually transform Wei Liang from a merchant into something unprecedented. an imperial advisor on matters of practical wisdom. He would spend the rest of his career traveling not to deliver silk, but to collect and share the kind of understanding that can only be discovered when our carefully laid plans meet the immovable realities of life. But the most profound change wasn't in his external circumstances. It was in his relationship to uncertainty itself. Where he had once seen obstacles as problems to be solved, he now recognized them as teachers offering lessons that couldn't be learned any other way. The blocked pass had shown him that true success isn't about getting what we want, but about discovering the awareness that remains peaceful, regardless of whether our desires are fulfilled. Years later, when students would seek Wei Liang's guidance on handling life's unexpected challenges, he would share a practice that had grown from his experience with the blocked pass. He would place a beautiful piece of silk on a table, then deliberately spill tea across its surface, watching their reactions as the precious fabric was seemingly ruined. "Now," he would ask gently, "what has really been lost?" Most would stare at the stained silk with dismay, speaking of waste, of destruction, of irreplaceable beauty being destroyed. But eventually, someone would begin to see what Wei Liang was pointing toward. The silk is still silk, they would realize. Its essential nature hasn't changed, only our plans for it have been altered. "Exactly," Wei Liang would smile, carefully lifting the fabric to reveal that the tea had created an entirely new pattern, more intricate and beautiful than the original design. And what does this teach us about our own essential nature when life stains our carefully laid plans? This simple demonstration became known throughout the region as the teaching of the stained silk. It helped countless people understand that disruption isn't destruction, but often revelation, showing us possibilities we could never have imagined when we were clinging too tightly to our original intentions. The Master of Silent Thunder. Our journey now takes us to the bamboo forests of ancient Japan, where a Zen master named Dogen had discovered that the most powerful teachings often arrive without a single word being spoken. Master Dogen lived in a small temple called Kokoin, nestled so deeply in the bamboo groves that visitors often said they felt they had stepped outside of time itself. The sound of wind moving through thousands of bamboo stalks created a constant, gentle music that seemed to wash away the urgency and noise of the outside world. Here, in this sanctuary of green shadows and dancing light, Dogen had spent 30 years exploring the deepest mysteries of human consciousness. Unlike many teachers of his era, Dogen was known for his unconventional methods. While other masters relied on elaborate discourses, complex philosophical debates, or dramatic demonstrations to convey their understanding, Dogen had discovered something remarkable. Silence itself could be a more powerful teacher than any words ever spoken. Students would travel for months to reach Kokoin, carrying burning questions about the nature of reality, the path to enlightenment, or the meaning of their suffering. They would arrive expecting profound lectures, intensive meditation retreats, or at least detailed instructions for their practice. Instead, they would often find Dogen simply sitting quietly in his garden, watching clouds drift across the sky, or observing the way morning light moved through the bamboo leaves. Many visitors left disappointed, convinced they had wasted their journey on a master who had nothing to teach. But those who stayed, those who allowed themselves to settle into the profound stillness that surrounded Dogen like an invisible field, began to discover something extraordinary. In the space of his silence, their own inner noise gradually quieted. In the depth of his presence, their anxious seeking began to dissolve into a natural peace they had never experienced before. One autumn day, a young samurai named Takeshi arrived at the temple in a state of profound spiritual crisis. He had dedicated his life to the warrior's code, finding meaning and identity in service to his lord and mastery of the martial arts. But a recent battle had shaken him to his core. He had witnessed suffering so intense, death so meaningless, that all his beliefs about honor and purpose had crumbled like leaves in a winter storm. Takeshi approached the temple gates with the desperate urgency of someone whose entire worldview had collapsed overnight. He had heard stories of Master Dogen's wisdom and had traveled here seeking answers that might help him reconstruct some meaning from the ruins of his former life. He found Dogen sitting in the temple's central courtyard, perfectly still, his eyes resting gently on a small pond where koi fish moved in lazy circles beneath floating lotus leaves. Takeshi bowed formally and launched into an impassioned account of his spiritual crisis, his voice growing more agitated as he described the meaninglessness that now seemed to pervade everything he had once held sacred. "Master," he concluded, his voice nearly breaking with desperation, "I have lost all sense of purpose. Everything I believed about life, about honor, about why we're here, it all feels like illusion now. Please, help me understand why we suffer. Help me find meaning in a world that seems utterly meaningless." Dogen listened to this outpouring with complete attention, his posture remaining utterly relaxed, his breathing steady and deep. When Takeshi finished speaking, the master simply returned his gaze to the pond, saying nothing at all. Minutes passed in silence, then more minutes. A full hour went by without a single word being exchanged. Takeshi felt his frustration mounting. Had he traveled all this way only to be ignored? Was this famous master nothing more than a fraud who hid his ignorance behind mysterious silence? His warrior's mind began generating angry thoughts, accusations, plans to leave immediately and seek wisdom elsewhere. But something in Dogen's quality of presence prevented Takeshi from storming away. There was nothing dismissive or aloof in the master's silence. If anything, it felt like the most complete listening Takeshi had ever experienced, as if his words were being received not just by Dogen's ears, but by his entire being. Gradually, Takeshi found his mental agitation beginning to settle. The urgent need for immediate answers started to soften. Without quite realizing it, he began to notice things that his anxious seeking had prevented him from seeing. The way afternoon light created shifting patterns on the temple walls, the sound of water trickling from a hidden fountain, the profound aliveness that seemed to pulse through every leaf and stone in the garden. More remarkably, he began to notice the quality of his own awareness. Beneath all his desperate questions and philosophical confusion, something remained utterly peaceful, completely untroubled by his crisis of meaning. This aware presence didn't need answers to be complete. It didn't require understanding to be whole. It simply was, constant and clear, like the sky that holds both storms and sunshine with equal ease. As the sun began to set and evening shadows lengthened across the courtyard, Dogen finally spoke. But his words were not what Takeshi had expected. "The koi have been swimming in circles all afternoon," the master observed quietly, "but they don't seem concerned about going anywhere in particular." Takeshi stared at him, uncertain whether this was profound wisdom or simple observation. "Master, I don't understand. I came seeking answers to the deepest questions of existence, and you speak of fish swimming in circles?" Dogen smiled gently and gestured toward the pond. "Look more carefully. What do you actually see?" Takeshi turned his attention to the water, expecting to see nothing more than fish engaged in aimless movement. but as he watched with the kind of open attention that his hours of silence had cultivated, he began to notice something remarkable. The koi weren't swimming randomly at all. They were responding moment by moment to subtle currents in the water, to the availability of food, to the play of light and shadow, to countless factors that created a kind of underwater dance of perfect responsiveness. "They're not trying to go anywhere," Takeshi said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. "They're simply responding to what each moment offers. And are they suffering from their lack of a grand destination?" Takeshi watched the fish move with their natural grace, completely present to whatever was happening in their watery world. No, they seem content, complete. "What makes you different from those fish?" Dogen asked, his voice carrying a quality of gentle curiosity rather than challenge. The question stopped Takeshi completely. For hours, he had been lost in stories about meaning and meaninglessness, purpose and purposelessness, honor and dishonor. But the fish weren't telling themselves any stories at all. They were simply living, moment by moment, responding to what was actually present, rather than what they thought should be present. "I'm different because I think I need a reason to exist," Takeshi said, his voice filled with wonder at this recognition. "I've been trying to find meaning outside of this moment, outside of simply being alive and aware." Dogen nodded slowly. "And what happens when you stop looking for meaning and simply notice what it feels like to be aware right now?" Takeshi turned his attention inward, feeling into the simple fact of his own consciousness. Gradually, he became aware of something he had never noticed before. Existence itself was inherently meaningful, not because of any story or purpose he could construct, but because awareness itself was a kind of miracle that needed no justification. "It's already meaningful," he whispered, "not because of anything I do or understand, but because consciousness itself is extraordinary." "This is what the fish know without thinking about it," Dogen said. "This is what the bamboo knows as it sways in the wind, what the stones know as they rest in the garden. Meaning isn't something you find. It's something you recognize you've never actually been without." They sat together in the gathering darkness, two human beings sharing the simple miracle of being aware in a universe that had somehow awakened to itself through their consciousness. Takeshi felt a peace settling into his bones that was unlike anything his philosophical seeking had ever produced. It wasn't the peace of having found answers, but the peace of recognizing that the question itself arose from a misunderstanding. Over the following days, Takeshi remained at the temple, not as a student seeking teaching, but as someone learning to rest in the natural completeness of present moment awareness. Dogen continued his practice of responding to questions with silence, with simple observations, with invitations to look more deeply at what was already present, rather than seeking what seemed to be missing. Other students came and went during this period, and Takeshi watched with growing amazement as Dogen's wordless teaching affected each person differently. A merchant obsessed with profit would sit with the master and gradually discover an appreciation for beauty that had nothing to do with monetary value. A scholar lost in intellectual complexity would find himself delighting in the simple pleasure of breathing. A mother overwhelmed by responsibility would touch a sense of natural ease she had forgotten was possible. The remarkable thing was that Dogen rarely offered specific instructions or detailed explanations. Instead, his presence itself seemed to remind people of something they had always known but had forgotten in the busyness of their seeking. He was like a tuning fork that helped others remember their own natural frequency. One morning, as Takeshi prepared to return to his life in the world, he asked Dogen a final question. "Master, How do you teach so effectively without using words? What is the secret of your silent instruction? Dogen considered this question for a long moment, then walked to the edge of the pond where a single lotus flower floated on the surface. He picked up the flower and held it silently, his eyes meeting Takeshi's with a gentle smile. No words were exchanged, but in that simple gesture, Takeshi understood something that could never have been explained verbally. The flower wasn't a symbol or metaphor. It was just itself, complete, perfect, requiring no improvement or interpretation. In the same way, each moment of existence was already complete, each person already whole, each experience already meaningful, exactly as it was. The teaching wasn't something separate from life that needed to be added to it. The teaching was life itself, recognized clearly. Years later, Takeshi would become known as a samurai of unusual wisdom, someone who brought a quality of presence and natural responsiveness to everything he did. When asked about his transformation, he would often share the story of his time with Master Dogen. But the most profound part of his account was always the same. The deepest teaching had happened in the spaces between words, in the quality of attention that silence makes possible. True understanding, Takeshi would say, doesn't come from adding more information to your mind. It comes from removing the noise that prevents you from recognizing what you've always already known. This became known as the teaching of the silent thunder, the recognition that the most powerful truths often arrive not as dramatic revelations, but as quiet remembrances of what was never actually forgotten, only temporarily obscured by our constant mental commentary about life rather than our direct participation in it. The student who discovered gold in confusion. Our next tale brings us to the bustling monastery of Shaolin, where a young woman named Li Mei was about to discover that her greatest spiritual obstacle might actually be her most precious teacher. Li Mei had arrived at the monastery with credentials that impressed even the most senior monks. She held advanced degrees in Buddhist philosophy from 3 different universities, could recite major sutras from memory in 4 languages, and had written scholarly papers on meditation techniques that were respected throughout academic circles. Her knowledge of Buddhist doctrine was encyclopedic, her intellectual grasp of enlightenment concepts sophisticated and nuanced. Yet despite all this learning, Li Mei felt spiritually empty. She could explain the nature of suffering with academic precision, but couldn't seem to find lasting peace in her own heart. She could analyze the mechanics of meditation, but struggled to maintain even basic concentration during practice. Most troubling of all, she could discuss enlightenment eloquently, but had never touched even a glimpse of the direct experience that all her studies pointed toward. This gap between her intellectual understanding and her lived experience had brought her to Shaolin, hoping that intensive practice in a traditional setting might bridge the chasm between knowing about awakening and actually awakening. She approached the monastery's training with the same methodical intensity that had made her an academic success, determined to apply rigorous study and disciplined effort to the challenge of spiritual realization. The monastery's daily schedule was demanding. 4 hours of seated meditation before dawn, physical training that pushed the body to its limits, work periods that required complete attention to mundane tasks, and evening Dharma talks that explored the deepest aspects of Buddhist understanding. Li Mei threw herself into each activity with scholarly precision, taking detailed notes on her meditation experiences, analyzing her progress with scientific methodology, and approaching each teaching as data to be processed and integrated. But something puzzling began to happen. The more systematically she approached her practice, the more confused she became. Meditation sessions that she entered with clear intentions would dissolve into mental chaos. Teachings that seemed crystal clear during Dharma talks would become incomprehensible when she tried to apply them. Simple tasks like sweeping the courtyard or preparing meals would somehow become sources of frustration and self-doubt. Master Chen, the elderly teacher who oversaw the training program, watched Li Mei's struggles with the patient eyes of someone who had seen this pattern many times before. During their private meetings, he would listen to her detailed analyses of her difficulties, her theoretical frameworks for understanding her obstacles, and her increasingly complex strategies for overcoming her confusion. Perhaps, he suggested gently, after one particularly elaborate explanation of her meditation difficulties, you are trying to solve a problem that doesn't actually exist. Li Mei looked at him with genuine bewilderment. But Master, I came here because I lack direct experience of the teachings. Surely that's a problem that needs to be solved? Master Chen smiled and gestured toward the window, where afternoon light was filtering through leaves that danced in a gentle breeze. Tell me, what do you see there? I see sunlight and leaves, Li Mei replied, uncertain where this was leading. The interplay of light and shadow, the movement created by air currents, the way photons interact with chlorophyll to create the perception of green. Stop, Master Chen said gently. Look again, but this time don't think about what you're seeing. Just see. Li Mei turned back to the window, trying to follow his instruction, but her mind immediately began its familiar process of analysis and categorization. She couldn't seem to just see without simultaneously understanding, explaining, and contextualizing what her eyes were taking in. I can't do it, she admitted with frustration. My mind won't stop analyzing. Even when I try to just see, I'm thinking about trying to just see. Ah, Master Chen nodded with evident satisfaction. Now you're beginning to understand your real situation. What do you mean? For years, you've been studying awakening as if it were something you don't have, something you need to acquire through effort and understanding. But what if awakening is simply the natural state of seeing without the mental commentary? What if you've been looking for something you've never actually been without? Li Mei felt a familiar confusion rising, but this time Master Chen's words seemed to point towards something important rather than creating another intellectual puzzle to solve. Are you saying that awareness itself is enlightenment? I'm not saying anything about enlightenment, Master Chen replied with a gentle laugh. I'm asking you to notice what it's like to be aware right now without making that awareness into a spiritual concept. This instruction launched Li Mei into the most challenging period of her stay at the monastery. For days, she would sit in meditation, trying to experience pure awareness without turning it into an object of study. But every time she thought she was making progress, she would realize she was analyzing her progress, which would lead to frustration, which would lead to analysis of the frustration, creating endless loops of mental commentary. Her confusion deepened when she noticed that the monastery's most peaceful and wise students seemed to be those who had no particular interest in analyzing their spiritual state. They approached their practice with natural simplicity, worked with unhurried presence, and moved through their days with an ease that her complex understanding seemed to prevent rather than facilitate. One evening, after a particularly frustrating meditation session where her mind had been especially chaotic, Li Mei found herself walking alone in the monastery's garden. The moon was full, casting everything in silver light that seemed to dissolve the familiar boundaries between objects. As she rounded a corner, she encountered something that stopped her completely. There, sitting perfectly still beneath a flowering tree, was the monastery's cat. The animal was simply present, alert but relaxed, its attention resting naturally on the night sounds around it. There was no apparent effort in its awareness, no struggle to maintain concentration, no analysis of its experience. It was just completely, unself-consciously present. Li Mei found herself sitting down nearby, drawn by the cat's quality of natural ease. As she settled into stillness, something remarkable began to happen. Without trying to meditate or practice awareness, without any particular spiritual intention at all, her mind began to quiet in a way it never had during formal practice. The constant mental commentary that usually filled her consciousness started to settle like sediment in still water. For the first time in years, she experienced moments of pure perception, seeing the moonlight without thinking about moonlight, hearing night sounds without labeling them, feeling the cool air without comparing it to other temperatures. In these gaps between thoughts, Li Mei discovered something that all her studying had never revealed. Awareness itself was naturally peaceful, naturally clear, naturally present. It didn't need to be cultivated or improved or understood. It simply was, like the space in which all experiences appeared and dissolved. She sat with the cat until dawn, not because she was practicing meditation, but because she was discovering the profound rest that comes when we stop trying to improve our relationship with the present moment and simply allow ourselves to be naturally aware. When Master Chen found her there the next morning, still sitting in the garden with the expression of quiet wonder on her face, he simply nodded with understanding. "How was your night of not meditating?" he asked with a gentle smile. "I don't know how to describe it," Li Mei said, her voice carrying a quality of settled amazement. "I wasn't trying to be aware, but awareness was more clear than it's ever been. I wasn't trying to find peace, but peace was just naturally present. It's like I've been looking for something I was already experiencing, but couldn't recognize because I was looking too hard." "And what about all your confusion? Where did that go?" Li Mei considered this question, feeling into her present experience. "It's still here, but it's different. Before, confusion felt like a problem I needed to solve. Now it feels like weather. It comes and goes, but it doesn't disturb the awareness that notices it." Master Chen sat down beside her, sharing the simple pleasure of morning light beginning to warm the garden. "This is what we call the pathless path. You can't walk toward awareness because you're already aware. You can't achieve presence because you're already present. The spiritual journey isn't about getting somewhere else. It's about recognizing where you've always been." Over the remaining weeks of her stay, Li Mei's approach to practice transformed completely. Instead of trying to meditate correctly, she would simply sit and allow whatever was present to be present. Instead of analyzing the Dharma teachings, she would listen with the same natural openness she had discovered in the garden. Instead of working toward enlightenment, she would engage with whatever task was at hand with complete attention. The paradox was remarkable. The less she tried to be spiritual, the more naturally spiritual qualities seemed to express themselves through her. Compassion arose spontaneously when others were suffering, not because she thought she should be compassionate. Wisdom emerged in challenging situations, not because she had studied wise responses. Peace remained stable even during difficult circumstances, not because she had learned techniques for maintaining peace. When the time came for Li Mei to leave the monastery, Master Chen offered her a final teaching that would guide the rest of her life. "You came here as a student seeking enlightenment," he said. "You're leaving as enlightenment recognizing itself as a student. The difference is not in what you know, but in what you've stopped trying to know." Li Mei bowed deeply, understanding that her greatest teacher had been the confusion she had initially seen as her greatest obstacle. Every moment of not knowing had been an invitation to discover the aware presence that needed no knowledge to be complete. Every instance of mental chaos had been an opportunity to find the stillness that exists at the center of all movement. Years later, Li Mei would become known as a teacher who specialized in helping overeducated spiritual seekers discover the simplicity that their complexity had obscured. Her approach was revolutionary in its ordinariness. Instead of offering new practices or advanced techniques, she would invite students to notice what was already naturally present before they began trying to improve it. The spiritual path, she would often say, is like polishing a mirror. But most of us get so focused on the polishing that we forget to look at what the mirror is actually reflecting. Confusion isn't the opposite of clarity. It's clarity recognizing that it doesn't need to understand itself to be clear. This simple recognition became the foundation of what Li Mei called the teaching of confused clarity, the understanding that our deepest wisdom often emerges not despite our confusion, but through our willingness to remain present with not knowing until it reveals its hidden gifts. The farmer who planted seeds in winter. As autumn deepens into winter across the ancient valleys of Tibet, we encounter our next teacher, a simple farmer named Pemba, whose story reveals how apparent endings can become the most fertile beginnings. Pemba had worked the same patch of mountain soil for 43 years, following the rhythms his grandfather had taught him and his grandfather before that. Spring planting, summer tending, autumn harvest, winter rest. His life moved with the predictable cycles that had sustained his family for generations, and he found deep satisfaction in this ancient dance between human effort and natural timing. But this particular year had tested every assumption Pemba held about how life should unfold. An early frost had destroyed half his barley crop just weeks before harvest. Unexpected flooding had washed away his carefully tended potato fields. Even his small apple orchard, which had produced reliably for decades, had yielded almost nothing due to a mysterious blight that no one in the village could explain. As winter approached, Pemba faced a reality he had never encountered before: complete agricultural failure. His storage rooms, which should have been filled with grain and root vegetables to sustain his family through the harsh mountain winter, were nearly empty. His neighbors, facing their own challenges from the difficult growing season, had little surplus to share. For the first time in his adult life, Pemba didn't know how his family would survive the coming months. The traditional response would have been to travel to the valley settlements, seeking work as a laborer or borrowing against future harvests. But something in Pemba resisted this practical solution. Perhaps it was stubbornness, perhaps intuition, but he found himself drawn to spend time in his barren fields, walking among the empty furrows and contemplating the mystery of this unprecedented failure. It was during one of these solitary walks that Pemba encountered someone who would change his understanding of both farming and life itself. An elderly man sat resting beside the path that bordered Pemba's land, his simple robes and peaceful demeanor marking him as one of the wandering teachers who occasionally passed through their remote region. "Difficult season," the old man observed as Pemba approached, his eyes taking in the obviously unsuccessful fields. "The worst I've ever seen," Pemba replied, settling down beside the stranger. 43 years of farming, and I've never had everything fail at once like this. I'm beginning to think the land itself is rejecting my efforts." The old teacher was quiet for a long moment, his gaze resting on the brown stubble that covered Pemba's fields. "Tell me, he finally said. "What do you see when you look at your land right now?" Pemba followed the teacher's gaze across his property, seeing only the evidence of his failure. "I see waste, empty fields that should be providing for my family, soil that has somehow betrayed the trust I placed in it, the end of everything I thought I knew about farming." "Look again," the teacher said gently. "But this time don't look as a farmer whose crops have failed. Look as someone who has never seen farmland before. What do you actually see?" Pemba struggled with this instruction. So accustomed was he to viewing his land through the lens of productivity and success. But gradually, as he allowed his expectations to soften, he began to notice details that his disappointment had obscured. The soil, rather than appearing depleted, actually looked rich and dark, well rested after the season's minimal demands. The field's natural contours, usually hidden by growing crops, revealed a subtle beauty he had never observed before. "It looks peaceful," Pemba said slowly, "like land that's been given permission to simply exist without having to produce anything." The teacher nodded with evident satisfaction. "And how does the land feel about its failure to meet your expectations?" The question struck Pemba as almost absurd at first. How could land have feelings about human expectations? But as he sat in the growing twilight, something in the quality of silence around them invited him to consider the question more deeply. The fields didn't seem to be suffering from their lack of productivity. The soil didn't appear troubled by its failure to support successful crops. If anything, there was a quality of natural ease about the landscape that Pemba had been too focused on outcomes to notice. The land doesn't seem concerned about failing, he realized with growing wonder. It's just being land, resting, maybe preparing for something I can't see yet. "What if?" the teacher asked, his voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had discovered something important. "What if this apparent failure is actually the land teaching you about a different kind of success? What if winter isn't the end of the growing cycle, but the most essential part of it?" Over the following hours, as stars emerged in the clear mountain air, the old teacher shared with Pemba a way of understanding that revolutionized everything he thought he knew about farming, success, and the nature of life itself. He spoke of how the most fertile soil was often created by the complete decomposition of what had come before, how the most abundant harvests frequently followed the most challenging winters, how nature's intelligence operated on timescales and through processes that human planning could rarely anticipate or control. "Your grandfather's grandfather knew something that modern farmers often forget," the teacher explained. "They understood that the farmer's job isn't to force the land to produce, but to align with natural cycles that are far more intelligent than any individual human understanding." "But my family needs food now," Pemba protested. "I can't feed them with philosophical understanding about natural cycles." The teacher smiled with the kind of compassion that comes from having faced similar challenges. True understanding of natural cycles doesn't ignore practical needs. It reveals practical solutions that force and worry cannot see. "Tell me, what grows naturally on your land when you're not trying to make it grow anything specific?" Pemba considered this question, thinking back to corners of his property that he had never cultivated, areas where wild plants had established themselves without any human intervention. Wild barley grows in the rocky areas. There are root vegetables that appear near the water sources, medicinal herbs that the village healer sometimes gathers. And do these plants seem troubled by winter? Do they fail to provide what's needed when their time comes? As Pemba reflected on this, he began to see his land and his situation from an entirely different perspective. The wild plants didn't experience the stress and anxiety that had been consuming him because they operated from trust in natural timing rather than human expectations about when and how abundance should manifest. "What would happen," the teacher asked, "if you spent this winter learning to see your land the way these wild plants experience it? Not as a resource that should produce on demand, but as a living system that has its own wisdom about when and how to provide what's needed." This conversation planted a seed in Pemba's consciousness that would grow throughout the challenging winter months ahead. Instead of spending his time worrying about the failed harvest or desperately seeking solutions to his immediate problems, he began to study his land with the kind of patient attention he had never given it before. He noticed which areas collected and held water naturally, where wind patterns created microclimates that might support different types of plants. He observed how wild animals moved through his property, what they ate, where they sheltered. Most importantly, he began to pay attention to subtle signs of life and potential that had been invisible to him when he was focused solely on his planned crops. As winter deepened, something remarkable began to happen. Neighbors who had initially viewed Pemba's contemplative approach to his agricultural crisis as impractical began seeking him out for advice about their own farming challenges. His new way of seeing land and working with natural systems, rather than against them, offered solutions to problems that conventional methods couldn't address. More significantly, Pemba discovered that his apparent failure had opened doorways to possibilities he had never imagined. The village healer, learning about his newfound understanding of wild plants and natural systems, asked him to help establish a medicinal garden that could serve the entire community. A group of younger farmers, frustrated with the limitations of traditional approaches, sought his guidance in developing more sustainable methods that worked with, rather than against, natural cycles. By spring, what had seemed like complete disaster had transformed into the beginning of a new way of life that was more fulfilling and ultimately more abundant than anything Pemba had experienced during his decades of conventional farming. He had discovered that winter, both literal and metaphorical, wasn't a season of death, but a time of invisible preparation for forms of life that couldn't have emerged without the space that apparent failure had created. The first crops he planted that spring were unlike anything he had grown before. Instead of fighting against his land's natural tendencies, he worked with them, creating polycultures that mimicked the wild plant communities he had studied so carefully during the winter months. The results were extraordinary. Not only higher yields than he had achieved in years, but soil that actually improved with each season rather than becoming depleted. More importantly, Pemba had discovered a way of approaching life's challenges that transformed obstacles into opportunities for discovering possibilities that force and conventional thinking could never reveal. He had learned that sometimes the most important thing a farmer can do is nothing, creating space for natural intelligence to reveal solutions that human planning could never anticipate. Years later, when students of sustainable agriculture would visit Pemba's thriving farm, they would often ask about the secret to his remarkable success. His answer would always point back to that devastating winter when everything he thought he knew about farming had failed. The secret, he would say with the kind of smile that comes from having discovered treasure in apparent disaster, is learning to plant seeds in winter. Not seeds in the soil, but seeds of attention, patience, and trust in processes that are far more intelligent than our individual understanding. The harvest that matters most often grows from failures that teach us to stop forcing and start flowing. This became known throughout the region as the teaching of winter seeds, the understanding that our greatest apparent failures often create the precise conditions necessary for discoveries and developments that success, with its tendency toward repetition and complacency, could never make possible. The weaver who found perfection in broken threads. In the mountain village of Thangka, where prayer flags flutter against impossible blue skies and the air carries the scent of juniper and ancient wisdom, lived a master weaver whose story reveals how our deepest flaws might actually be our greatest gifts. Dolma had inherited her loom from her grandmother, along with patterns that had been passed down through 7 generations of women who had devoted their lives to creating textiles of extraordinary beauty. The tapestries produced in their family workshop were sought after throughout Tibet and beyond, prized not only for their technical excellence, but for a quality of presence that seemed to emanate from every thread. For 20 years, Dolma had maintained the family tradition with meticulous precision. Her fingers moved across the loom with the confidence of someone who had mastered every aspect of her craft. She could judge the tension of warp threads by touch, select dye colors that would age into perfect harmony, and execute complex patterns that required months of unwavering attention to complete successfully. But perfectionism, while it had made Dolma's work technically flawless, had also become a subtle prison. She found herself spending hours correcting minor imperfections that no one else would ever notice. Projects that should have taken months stretched into years as she repeatedly undid and rewove sections that didn't meet her exacting standards. The joy she had once found in weaving had gradually been replaced by a constant anxiety about maintaining standards that seemed to grow more demanding with each passing year. The crisis that would transform everything began with what appeared to be a simple accident. Dolma was working on her most ambitious project yet, a large ceremonial tapestry commissioned for a new monastery being built in a neighboring valley. The pattern was incredibly complex, incorporating traditional motifs with innovations that had never been attempted before. 6 months of careful work had brought the piece to near completion when disaster struck. Her young nephew, visiting the workshop while she was away, accidentally knocked over a container of red dye that splashed across one corner of the nearly finished tapestry. The stain was dramatic and seemingly irreparable, covering an intricate section of the design with an irregular blotch that no amount of cleaning could remove. When Dolma discovered the damage, her first reaction was devastation so complete that she couldn't speak for several minutes. 6 months of work, the most challenging project of her career, ruined by a moment of childhood carelessness. Her nephew stood nearby in tears, apologizing repeatedly, but Dolma was too overwhelmed by the scope of the disaster to offer comfort. Her initial impulse was to begin the entire tapestry again. The monastery had been patient about the timeline, and she could probably complete a new version in another 6 months. But as days passed and she continued to stare at the damaged piece, something began to shift in her perception of the situation. The red stain, which had initially appeared as pure destruction, began to reveal unexpected possibilities. Its organic shape contrasted beautifully with the geometric precision of the surrounding pattern. The color, while unplanned, actually enhanced the overall composition in ways that her original design had not achieved. Most remarkably, the accident had created something that deliberate planning could never have produced. A quality of spontaneous life that made the entire piece more vibrant and alive. But accepting this required Dolma to release her attachment to the perfection she had spent decades pursuing. Could she really present a major commission that included such an obvious mistake? What would people think about her craftsmanship? How could she maintain her reputation for excellence while embracing such apparent failure? It was during this period of uncertainty that Dalma encountered a traveling monk who would help her see her situation from an entirely different perspective. He had stopped in the village while making a pilgrimage to remote monasteries and happened to visit her workshop while she was contemplating the damaged tapestry. "This is remarkable work," he said, studying the piece with evident appreciation. "The way this red area flows into the structured pattern creates such dynamic energy. How did you develop this technique?" Dalma looked at him with surprise. "Red area. It's a mistake. An accident that ruined months of careful work." The monk stepped closer to examine the tapestry more carefully, his eyes taking in not just the stained section, but the entire composition. "A mistake?" he said thoughtfully. "But it's the most alive part of the whole piece. Everything else, beautiful as it is, follows predictable patterns. This red area breaks the predictability in a way that makes the entire tapestry breathe with life." "But it's not what I intended," Dalma protested. "It represents a complete loss of control over the creative process." The monk smiled with the kind of understanding that comes from years of contemplating the nature of perfection and imperfection. "Tell me, when you're weaving according to predetermined patterns, how much space is there for surprise, for discovery, for something genuinely new to emerge?" Dalma considered this question, reflecting on her decades of pursuing technical excellence. "Very little, I suppose. Once I begin a traditional pattern, the outcome is largely determined from the start." "And how does that feel as a creative being? To always know exactly what you're creating before you create it?" This question touched something in Dalma that she had barely acknowledged to herself. Despite her reputation for excellence, she had been feeling increasingly constrained by her own expertise. The pursuit of perfection had gradually eliminated the element of discovery that had originally drawn her to weaving. She had become so skilled at avoiding mistakes that she had also eliminated the possibility of happy accidents, unexpected beauty, genuine surprise. "It feels limiting," she admitted. "Like I'm a machine reproducing predetermined outcomes rather than a human being participating in the creative mystery." "What if," the monk asked gently, "what if this stain isn't a mistake but a teaching? What if it's showing you something about the relationship between control and creativity that years of technical mastery couldn't reveal?" Over the following days, as Dalma contemplated the monk's words, she began to see her damaged tapestry as an invitation rather than a disaster. Instead of fighting against the red stain or trying to minimize its impact, she decided to work with it, allowing its organic energy to influence how she completed the remaining sections of the piece. This required a fundamental shift in her approach to weaving. Instead of following predetermined patterns exactly, she began to let the developing composition guide her choices. Where the red stain created unexpected color relationships, she emphasized them. Where its irregular shape broke the geometric rhythm, she allowed other elements to echo that organic quality. The result was unlike anything Dalma had ever created. The finished tapestry maintained all the technical excellence of her traditional work, while incorporating a quality of spontaneous life that made it truly extraordinary. When she delivered it to the monastery, the response was immediate and profound. The monks who received it spoke not only of its beauty, but of a quality of presence that seemed to invite contemplation and meditation. "This piece has a quality we've never encountered before," the head lama told Dolma. "It demonstrates technical mastery while also embodying something wild and free. It's as if perfection and imperfection have been woven together to create something beyond both." Word of Dolma's revolutionary approach to weaving spread throughout the region. Students began arriving at her workshop not to learn traditional techniques, but to understand how to incorporate spontaneity and accident into disciplined craft. She developed a teaching method that she called dancing with mistakes, showing weavers how to recognize when apparent errors were actually invitations to discover possibilities that planning alone could never reveal. The most profound change, however, was in Dolma's relationship to her own creative process. The anxiety about perfection that had plagued her for years dissolved into a natural ease that made weaving joyful again. She learned to hold her technical skills lightly, using them as tools for exploration rather than as rigid requirements for acceptability. "Perfect technique," she would tell her students, "is like a beautifully built cage. It protects you from certain kinds of failure, but it also prevents you from discovering what lies beyond the boundaries of what you already know how to do." True mastery isn't about eliminating mistakes. It's about developing the sensitivity to recognize when a mistake is actually a doorway to something more beautiful than you had imagined possible. This approach transformed not only Dolma's weaving, but her entire way of moving through life. She began to approach challenges and unexpected developments with curiosity rather than resistance, seeing them as opportunities for discovery rather than threats to her plans. Her relationships deepened as she learned to appreciate the beautiful imperfections in herself and others that made genuine connection possible. Years later, the tapestry with the red stain would become the most celebrated piece ever produced in the village of Thangka. Visitors would travel great distances just to see the work that demonstrated how technical excellence and spontaneous freedom could be woven together to create something that transcended both. But for Dolma, the real treasure wasn't the fame or recognition that came with her revolutionary approach to weaving. It was the daily experience of engaging with her craft and her life from a place of relaxed alertness that could welcome both success and failure as equally valuable teachers. "The red stain taught me something that 20 years of perfect weaving never could," she would often say when sharing her story. "It showed me that the most beautiful things emerge not when we eliminate the possibility of mistakes, but when we develop the wisdom to recognize which mistakes are actually invitations to discover forms of beauty we could never have planned." This became known throughout the weaving communities of Tibet as the teaching of the perfect flaw, the understanding that our greatest limitations often become doorways to our most authentic gifts when we learn to work with them rather than against them. The merchant who sold everything and found abundance. As prayer wheels turn in monasteries across the Himalayas and merchants' bells echo through ancient market squares, our journey brings us to a tale that reveals how true wealth might be found in the very act of letting go of everything we think we need to possess. In the prosperous trading city of Gyansi, where caravans from India, China, and the Mongolian steppes converged to exchange goods from across the known world, lived a merchant named Tashi Norbu, whose success had become both his greatest achievement and his most subtle burden. Over 15 years of careful trading, shrewd negotiations, and calculated risks, he had built a commercial empire that included warehouses full of precious goods, a network of trading relationships spanning 3 countries, and wealth that afforded his family every comfort their mountain culture could provide. Yet despite his material success, Tashi found himself increasingly troubled by a growing sense of emptiness that no amount of profit seemed able to fill. Each successful transaction, rather than bringing satisfaction, only highlighted how temporary and ultimately meaningless his accumulation felt. He would stand in his warehouses, surrounded by silk from China, spices from India, and precious stones from distant mines, wondering why none of these treasures could touch the persistent longing in his heart for something he couldn't name. The turning point came during what should have been the most triumphant moment of Tashi's career. A trade delegation from the imperial court had approached him with an offer that would triple his wealth overnight, exclusive rights to supply luxury goods for a series of royal ceremonies. The commission would establish him as the most successful merchant in the region and secure his family's prosperity for generations to come. But as Tashi reviewed the contracts in his study, surrounded by ledgers documenting his accumulated wealth, something unexpected happened. Instead of excitement about this unprecedented opportunity, he felt a weight settling onto his chest that made it difficult to breathe. The thought of managing even more inventory, negotiating even more complex deals, and shouldering even greater financial responsibilities filled him not with anticipation, but with something approaching dread. That night, unable to sleep, Tashi found himself walking through the narrow streets of Gyance's old quarter, where simple families lived in modest homes that somehow emanated a quality of contentment his mansion had never achieved. Through open doorways, he glimpsed scenes of ordinary domestic life, families sharing simple meals, children playing with toys made from scraps, elderly people sitting quietly by small fires, their faces reflecting a kind of peace that all his wealth had never purchased. It was during this midnight wandering that Tashi encountered someone who would transform his understanding of wealth, success, and the nature of true abundance. In a small alley, he came upon an elderly beggar sitting calmly beside a small shrine, his few possessions arranged neatly around him, his eyes reflecting a contentment that seemed to come from some inexhaustible inner source. "Good evening, friend," the old man said, with a warmth that surprised Tashi. Despite his obvious poverty, there was nothing desperate or needy in his manner. If anything, he seemed more at ease than most wealthy people Tashi knew. "Good evening," Tashi replied, finding himself drawn to sit beside this stranger whose presence somehow felt more substantial than that of the powerful merchants and officials he usually associated with. They sat together in comfortable silence for several minutes before the beggar spoke again. "You have the look of someone carrying a heavy load," he observed gently, "but I don't see any packages." Tashi laughed despite his troubled mood. "The heaviest loads are often invisible," he said. "I'm a merchant. My burdens are made of responsibilities, decisions, and possessions that require constant attention." The old man nodded with evident understanding. "Ah, yes. I used to carry those kinds of loads myself. Nearly killed me with their weight." "You were a merchant?" "For 30 years. Built up quite an empire, actually. Warehouses, trade routes, more gold than I could count. Thought I was the richest man in Tibet." Tashi studied the old man's simple robes and meager possessions with confusion. "What happened to your wealth?" The beggar smiled with the kind of joy that comes from having discovered something more valuable than anything money can buy. "I gave it all away. Every last piece of gold, every bolt of silk, every precious stone. Distributed it to people who needed it more than I did." "But why?" Tashi asked, genuinely bewildered. Surely building such wealth required tremendous effort. Why would you throw it all away? "Because I discovered something The more I gave away, the richer I felt. The lighter my possessions became, the more abundant my life seemed. It was the strangest thing. By losing everything I had spent decades accumulating, I found something I had been seeking my whole life without knowing it. What did you find? The beggar gestured to the simple alley where they sat, the starry sky overhead, the quiet contentment of the sleeping city around them. This, the extraordinary abundance that exists when you're not constantly worried about protecting what you have or acquiring what you think you need. The incredible wealth that becomes visible when you stop looking at life through the lens of ownership and start experiencing it through the eyes of gratitude. Over the following hours, as dawn approached and the city began to stir with the day's first activities, the old beggar shared with Tashi a way of understanding wealth that challenged everything he had believed about success, security, and happiness. He spoke of how possessions, while useful, could become prisons when we identified too strongly with owning them. How the energy required to maintain and protect accumulations often exceeded the joy those accumulations provided. How true abundance was more about our relationship to what we had than about the quantity of what we possessed. The strangest discovery, the beggar explained, was that giving everything away didn't make me poor, it made me free. Free from the constant worry about loss, free from the endless desire for more, free to appreciate the incredible richness that exists in every moment when you're not focused on what you lack or what you might lose. But surely you need some possessions to survive, Tashi asked, thinking of his own family's needs and responsibilities. Of course, the old man agreed, but there's a difference between using things and being used by them. When I was a merchant, I thought I owned my possessions, but actually they owned me. Every decision was filtered through their needs, their protection, their increase. I was a servant to my own wealth. As the morning light began to illuminate the alley, Tashi felt something shifting in his chest, a loosening of tension he hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. What would it look like to apply this understanding without giving away everything? I have responsibilities, people depending on me. The beggar nodded with understanding. The external form isn't what matters. Some people need to give away everything to discover freedom. Others can find it while maintaining their responsibilities. The key is changing your relationship to what you have, from ownership to stewardship, from accumulation to circulation, from hoarding to flowing. This conversation planted a seed in Tashi's consciousness that would revolutionize not only his approach to business, but his entire way of being in the world. When he returned home that morning, he looked at his warehouses, his inventories, his financial records with completely different eyes. Instead of seeing assets to be protected and increased, he began to see resources that wanted to flow, goods that were meant to serve rather than be hoarded, wealth that found its true purpose in circulation rather than accumulation. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Tashi began gradually, starting with small experiments in what he came to think of as conscious commerce. Instead of maximizing profit on every transaction, he began looking for deals that created genuine benefit for all parties involved. Rather than stockpiling goods in anticipation of price increases, he started moving inventory more quickly, ensuring that useful items reached people who could actually benefit from them. Most remarkably, he began incorporating generosity directly into his business model. For every profitable transaction, he would set aside a portion of the goods or proceeds to be distributed to families in need. This wasn't charity in the conventional sense. It was in recognition that his business success was inseparable from the well-being of the entire community that made his prosperity possible. The results were extraordinary and completely unexpected. Rather than reducing his profits, this approach actually increased them. Customers began seeking him out specifically because they trusted his integrity and knew that their purchases contributed to the wider community's well-being. Other merchants, initially skeptical of his methods, began adopting similar approaches when they witnessed his continued success. More importantly, the chronic anxiety that had plagued Tashi despite his material prosperity began to dissolve. The constant worry about protecting and increasing his wealth was replaced by a natural ease that came from viewing his business as a channel for beneficial activity rather than a mechanism for personal accumulation. The imperial contract that had initially triggered his crisis of meaning became an opportunity to demonstrate this new approach on a larger scale. Instead of viewing it as a chance for maximum personal profit, Tashi saw it as a way to create employment for dozens of local artisans, to showcase the finest products from across the region, and to demonstrate that commerce could serve beauty, craftsmanship, and community welfare simultaneously. His proposal to the imperial delegation was unprecedented. He would fulfill their requirements at cost, asking only for payment that would cover expenses and provide fair wages for all the craftspeople involved. In return, he requested that a portion of the royal ceremonies include recognition of the traditional arts and regional cultures that made such magnificence possible. The delegation was initially confused by this unconventional approach. Why would a successful merchant essentially volunteer for such an enormous project? But when they saw the quality of goods and services that Tashi's network could provide, and witnessed the genuine enthusiasm of everyone involved in the project, they recognized that they were encountering something remarkable. A form of commerce that elevated everyone it touched, rather than simply transferring wealth from one party to another. The royal ceremonies became legendary not just for their magnificence, but for their demonstration of what became known throughout the region as abundance economics. The recognition that true wealth multiplies when it's shared rather than hoarded, that the most successful businesses are those that create benefit for entire communities rather than extracting maximum profit for individual owners. Tashi's story spread far beyond the trading routes of Tibet. Merchants from across Asia began visiting Gyantse to understand how he had discovered a way of conducting business that created prosperity without the anxiety, competition, and spiritual emptiness that usually accompanied material success. When asked to explain his methods, Tashi would often begin by sharing the story of his encounter with the beggar who had once been a wealthy merchant. "He taught me the difference between having money and being rich," Tashi would say. "Having money is about accumulation, always trying to get more, always afraid of losing what you have. Being rich is about circulation, recognizing that wealth is like water, which only stays fresh when it keeps flowing." The practice that emerged from this understanding became known as the teaching of flowing abundance. Tashi would demonstrate it by taking a handful of grain from one of his warehouses and letting it pour slowly through his fingers back into the storage bin. "See how the grain behaves," he would tell visitors. "If I try to hold it too tightly, most of it escapes through my fingers anyway, and what remains becomes compressed and damaged. But if I hold it lightly, allowing it to flow naturally while guiding its direction, it serves its purpose of nourishing life. Wealth works exactly the same way. The more lightly we hold it, the more effectively it can fulfill its true function of supporting flourishing life." This teaching spread throughout the merchant communities of Central Asia, creating what historians would later recognize as one of the earliest examples of conscious capitalism, business practices based on the recognition that individual prosperity and community well-being are inseparable rather than competing interests. But for Tashi, the most profound change wasn't in his external circumstances or even in his business success. It was in his daily experience of being alive. The persistent emptiness that had haunted him during his years of conventional accumulation had been replaced by a sense of fullness that didn't depend on possessing anything in particular. He had discovered what the old beggar had tried to tell him: that true abundance is not a quantity of things, but a quality of awareness. The capacity to recognize and appreciate the incredible wealth that exists in every moment when we're not obsessed with getting more or protecting what we think we have. Years later, when students of both commerce and spirituality would visit Tashi to understand how he had integrated worldly success with inner peace, he would often conclude his teachings with a question that captured the essence of his discovery. What would happen to your relationship with wealth if you truly understood that everything you think you own is actually on loan from the universe, temporarily in your care so you can discover how to use it in service of life's flourishing? The moment you stop trying to possess abundance and start allowing abundance to flow through you, you discover that you have always been abundantly provided for. Not because you accumulated enough, but because abundance itself is your true nature. This recognition became the foundation of what spread throughout the region as the way of sacred commerce. The understanding that business, when conducted from awareness of our fundamental interconnection, becomes a spiritual practice that serves not only individual prosperity, but the well-being of all life. As the moon rises over ancient monasteries and butter lamps flicker in meditation halls across the Himalayas, our collection of transformative tales continues to weave itself into your consciousness. Each story we've shared tonight carries medicine for the modern soul. Practical wisdom that can transform how you meet tomorrow's challenges, next week's uncertainties, and all the years ahead. The threads of understanding we've been weaving together reveal a tapestry of profound simplicity. Peace is not something you achieve, but something you remember you have never been without. Wisdom is not information you acquire, but awareness you learn to trust. Freedom is not a destination you reach, but a way of dancing with whatever life presents. In the gentle space between these ancient teachings and your own direct experience, transformation continues its quiet work. Like seeds planted in winter soil, the insights you've received tonight will continue growing long after these words have faded, revealing their gifts in moments when you most need to remember what you've always known, but perhaps temporarily forgotten. Our journey through these timeless teachings continues, each tale building upon the last, creating an architecture of understanding that supports not just intellectual knowledge, but the kind of embodied wisdom that transforms how you move through each day. The masters who speak through these stories offer their gifts across centuries, their voices joining the chorus of awakened beings who have discovered that the peace we seek is always closer than our next breath, more available than our next thought. The scholar who learned to unlearn. In the great library of Nalanda, where countless volumes of Buddhist wisdom lined walls that had witnessed 1,000 years of scholarly pursuit, there lived a brilliant academic named Vasubandhu, whose vast learning had become the very obstacle preventing him from touching the truth he so desperately sought to understand. Vasubandhu possessed a mind of extraordinary capability. He could debate the subtlest points of Madhyamika philosophy in 3 languages, had memorized over 200 major texts, and had written commentaries that were studied throughout the Buddhist world. His reputation as a scholar extended from the universities of India to the monasteries of China, and students would travel for months just to attend his lectures on the nature of consciousness and reality. Yet despite this encyclopedic knowledge, Vasubandhu felt increasingly tormented by a growing sense that his understanding remained purely theoretical. He could explain emptiness with breathtaking precision, but had never experienced the direct realization of it. He could analyze the mechanics of enlightenment with scholarly brilliance, but couldn't seem to access even a glimpse of the awakened state he described so eloquently to others. This gap between his intellectual mastery and lived experience had become a source of profound anguish. Late at night, surrounded by scrolls and manuscripts that represented decades of accumulated learning, he would sit in his study, feeling like a man dying of thirst while surrounded by detailed maps of distant rivers. The crisis that would transform everything began when Vasubandhu received an invitation that should have represented the pinnacle of his academic career. The great monastery of Vikramashila was hosting a gathering of the most renowned Buddhist scholars from across Asia, and he had been asked to deliver the keynote address on the nature of ultimate reality. This was the kind of recognition that scholars spent lifetimes hoping to achieve. But as Vasubandhu prepared his presentation, meticulously organizing his arguments and selecting quotations from authoritative texts to support his positions, something unexpected happened. The more perfectly he crafted his intellectual framework, the more hollow it felt. Each brilliant insight seemed to take him further away from the living truth he was trying to convey rather than closer to it. 3 days before he was scheduled to depart for the conference, Vasubandhu made a decision that shocked everyone who knew him. He packed away all his texts, canceled his prestigious speaking engagement, and set out alone on foot toward the remote mountains, where it was said that simple forest monks lived in direct communion with the Dharma he had spent decades studying. After weeks of difficult travel, Vasubandhu arrived at a tiny hermitage perched on a cliff face so remote that few people even knew of its existence. The hermitage was home to an old monk named Aryadeva, whose reputation for wisdom existed only in whispered stories among village people. Unlike Vasubandhu, this monk had written no books, given no lectures, and accumulated no academic honors. He simply sat in meditation, tended a small garden, and occasionally offered guidance to the rare seeker who found their way to his retreat. When Vasubandhu introduced himself, explaining his scholarly achievements and his desperate need for teachings that could bridge the gap between knowledge and realization, Aryadeva listened with the complete attention of someone who had learned to hear not just words, but the heart behind them. "I have studied everything," Vasubandhu concluded his lengthy introduction, "but I understand nothing. I can explain the Dharma perfectly, but I cannot live it. Please teach me what all my learning has failed to reveal." Aryadeva was quiet for a long time, his eyes resting on the mountain peaks visible through the hermitage's simple window. When he finally spoke, his words carried the authority of someone who had touched something beyond the reach of intellectual analysis. "Show me your understanding," he said simply. Vasubandhu straightened with relief, finally given an opportunity to demonstrate the knowledge he had spent so many years accumulating. For over an hour, he delivered what amounted to a masterful dissertation on Buddhist philosophy, covering everything from the Four Noble Truths to the most sophisticated analyses of consciousness developed by the great masters. His exposition was flawless, comprehensive, and delivered with the kind of eloquence that had made him famous throughout the scholarly world. When he finished, Aryadeva nodded appreciatively. "Remarkable," he said. "You have clearly mastered everything the Buddha taught. Now please, Show me your mind. Vasubandhu blinked, uncertain what this meant. My mind? But I just showed you my understanding, which is the product of my mind's study and analysis. No, Aryadeva said gently. You showed me your memory. You demonstrated your ability to organize and present information. But I asked to see your mind, not what your mind contains, but what your mind actually is. This request launched Vasubandhu into the most challenging period of his life. For days, he tried to fulfill Aryadeva's instruction, attempting to observe his mind directly rather than through the conceptual frameworks he had spent decades developing. But every time he looked for his mind, he found only thoughts about mind, theories about consciousness, memories of teachings he had received about the nature of awareness. I can't find it, he finally admitted to Aryadeva in frustration. When I look for my mind, I only find concepts about mind. When I try to observe consciousness directly, I get lost in ideas about consciousness. Everything I encounter has been filtered through my learning. Good, Aryadeva smiled. This is the beginning of real understanding. For 30 years, you have been collecting descriptions of water while dying of thirst. Now you're discovering that no description, however accurate, can quench your thirst. But then how do I drink? How do I experience what I've been studying? Aryadeva gestured toward a small spring that bubbled up from rocks near the hermitage. When you're truly thirsty, do you analyze the chemical composition of water before drinking? Do you read treatises on hydration? Or do you simply put your lips? The water too, I simply drink. Then of course, drink, Aryadeva said quietly. Stop analyzing consciousness and be conscious. Stop studying awareness and be aware. Stop thinking about the present moment and be present. This instruction sounds simple, but for someone whose entire identity was built around intellectual understanding, it represented a complete revolution in approach. Vasubandhu had to learn to trust direct experience over conceptual knowledge, to value immediate presence over sophisticated analysis, to rest in not knowing rather than constantly trying to figure everything out. The process of unlearning everything he thought he knew proved far more challenging than learning had ever been. His mind, trained for decades to analyze and categorize every experience, initially couldn't rest in simple awareness without immediately creating thoughts about that awareness. Every moment of direct experience would quickly become an object of intellectual examination, pulling him back into the conceptual realm he was trying to transcend. But gradually, through Aryadeva's patient guidance and his own persistent practice of choosing presence over analysis, something began to shift. Vasubandhu discovered that there were gaps in his mental commentary, moments when he was simply aware without thinking about being aware, present without analyzing presence, conscious without consciousness becoming an object of study. In these gaps, he began to taste something he had read about countless times, but never directly experienced. The immediate, non-conceptual knowing that all the texts pointed toward, but could never actually convey. It was like finally drinking water after decades of studying its molecular structure. This is what I've been seeking all along, he told Aryadeva one morning, his voice filled with wonder. But it was never hidden in any text or teaching. It's been here all along, underneath all my thinking about it. And what is it? Aryadeva asked with a gentle smile. Vasubandhu opened his mouth to explain, then stopped himself as he realized what was happening. His scholarly mind was already trying to turn his direct experience back into concepts, to capture his realization in words and theories. I can't describe it without losing it, he said, laughing at the beautiful futility of trying to conceptualize the inconceivable. The moment I make it into an object of understanding, it stops being what it actually is. Now you're beginning to understand why the Buddha said so little about the ultimate nature of reality, Aryadeva observed. Not because it's mysterious or secret, but because it can only be pointed toward, never captured in concepts. The finger pointing at the moon is not the moon itself. Over the following months, Vasubandhu's entire relationship with learning and teaching transformed. Instead of accumulating more knowledge, he began the process of what he called sacred forgetting, gradually releasing his attachment to intellectual frameworks so that direct wisdom could emerge naturally. When he eventually returned to the scholarly world, his approach to teaching was completely different. Instead of delivering elaborate lectures filled with quotations and logical arguments, he would often sit in silence with his students, creating spaces where direct realization could occur naturally. His new teachings were characterized not by their intellectual sophistication, but by their power to awaken immediate recognition of what was already present. True learning, he would tell his students, is not about filling your mind with more information. It's about emptying your mind of everything that prevents you from recognizing what you've always already known. The scholar's disease is mistaking the menu for the meal, the map for the territory, the description for the reality it points toward. Students who had come expecting brilliant philosophical discourse often left confused, but somehow transformed. They couldn't always explain what they had learned, but they carried with them a sense of having touched something more real than any concept could convey. Vasubandhu developed a teaching method that became known throughout the region as the scholarship of unlearning. Instead of asking students to memorize texts, he would invite them to forget everything they thought they knew about enlightenment and simply rest in present moment awareness. Instead of analyzing the nature of mind, they would practice being mindful. Instead of studying descriptions of peace, they would cultivate the direct experience of inner stillness. The ultimate text, Vasubandhu would often say, is written not on paper, but in the immediacy of your own experience right now. The ultimate teacher is not any external authority, but your own capacity for present moment awareness. The ultimate teaching is not something you can possess, but something you can only be. This approach revolutionized Buddhist education in his region. Instead of producing scholars who could debate philosophy, but struggled to embody wisdom, his methods created students who might know fewer technical terms, but could access states of peace and clarity that transformed their daily lives. Years later, when other academics would ask Vasubandhu about his dramatic transformation from renowned scholar to advocate of direct experience, he would share a practice that had grown from his time with Aryadeva. He would hold up a flower and ask his questioners to explain what they saw. Most would immediately launch into detailed botanical descriptions, philosophical interpretations of the flower as a symbol, or poetic elaborations on its beauty. Vasubandhu would listen patiently, then ask a simple question. Now that you've explained the flower so thoroughly, are you actually seeing it? This question invariably stopped people completely. They would look at the flower again, suddenly realizing that all their thinking about it had actually prevented them from simply perceiving its immediate presence. This is the scholar's trap, Vasubandhu would explain gently. We become so skilled at thinking about reality that we forget how to directly experience it. We mistake our concepts for the living truth they point toward. Real wisdom begins when we learn to see the flower before we think about the flower, to be present before we analyze presence, to rest in awareness before we create theories about consciousness. This became known as the teaching of the unthought flower, the recognition that our most sophisticated intellectual understanding often becomes the very obstacle preventing us from touching the simple, immediate reality that all our thinking is attempting to grasp. The warrior who conquered himself. Our journey now carries us to the training grounds of ancient Japan, where a samurai named Musashi was about to discover that his greatest enemy was not any external opponent, but the very mindset that had made him invincible in battle. Miyamoto Musashi had never lost a duel. In 17 years of swordsmanship, he had defeated over 60 opponents, including some of the most renowned warriors of his era. His technique was flawless, his strategy brilliant, and his reputation for invincibility had spread throughout the island nation. Students traveled from distant provinces to learn from him, and lords competed to have him serve in their armies. Yet despite this unprecedented success, Musashi found himself increasingly troubled by a growing sense that his mastery of external combat had somehow created an inner war that was far more challenging than any battle he had ever fought. The very mindset that made him deadly with a sword, constant vigilance, aggressive strategy, the assumption that life was fundamentally about conflict, had begun to poison his experience of everything beyond the battlefield. He could not sit peacefully without his mind scanning for potential threats. He could not enjoy simple pleasures without calculating their strategic value. He could not form genuine relationships because he approached every interaction as a potential contest to be won or lost. The warrior's mind that served him so well in duels had become a tyrannical filter that turned the entire world into an arena of competition and danger. The crisis that would transform everything began with what should have been Musashi's greatest triumph. A challenger named Sasaki Kojiro, famous for his lightning-quick technique with an unusually long sword, had issued a formal challenge for a duel on the isolated island of Ganryu. This was to be the ultimate test of Musashi's abilities, a contest between the two most skilled swordsmen in Japan, witnessed by representatives of the imperial court. Musashi spent weeks preparing for this encounter, refining his technique, studying his opponent's known methods, and developing strategies that would counter Kojiro's advantages. But as the day of the duel approached, something unexpected happened. Instead of the focused confidence he usually felt before important battles, Musashi experienced a strange restlessness, a sense that something fundamental was missing from his preparation. On the morning of the duel, as he sailed toward Ganryu Island, Musashi made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of arriving early to survey the terrain and finalize his tactical plans, he deliberately delayed his departure, spending the morning in quiet contemplation rather than active preparation. This was completely contrary to his usual methodical approach, but something deeper than strategic thinking was guiding his choices. When he finally arrived at the island, several hours late, he found Kojiro waiting with barely controlled fury at this breach of protocol. The assembled witnesses murmured about Musashi's apparent disrespect, his lack of proper warrior etiquette. But Musashi moved with a calmness that seemed to come from somewhere beyond his usual pre-battle intensity. The duel that followed was unlike any contest Musashi had ever experienced. Instead of the calculated aggression that had characterized his previous victories, he found himself responding to Kojiro's attacks with a kind of effortless fluidity that seemed to arise spontaneously rather than from conscious strategy. His movements felt less like executing predetermined techniques and more like dancing with the natural rhythm of the encounter itself. The decisive moment came when Kojiro launched his most devastating attack, a lightning-fast thrust that had never failed to defeat an opponent. But instead of countering with his own aggressive technique, Musashi simply moved slightly to one side, allowing Kojiro's sword to pass harmlessly by while his own wooden practice sword found its mark with gentle precision. Kojiro fell, defeated not by superior aggression, but by Musashi's ability to remain so completely present and responsive that conflict itself seemed to dissolve into flow. The witnesses stood in stunned silence, having witnessed something they had never seen before. Victory achieved not through conquest, but through a kind of harmonious responsiveness that transcended the usual dynamics of combat. But what happened next would be remembered long after the technical details of the duel were forgotten. As Kojiro lay on the ground, clearly defeated but not seriously injured, Musashi knelt beside him with an expression of profound compassion rather than triumph. "Forgive me, brother," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the satisfaction of victory. "I have spent years perfecting the art of defeating others, but today I discovered something far more valuable: the art of not needing to defeat anyone at all." Or, Kojiro looked up at his conqueror with confusion and growing recognition. "What do you mean?" "You have just achieved the greatest victory possible for a warrior." "Have I?" Musashi asked, genuinely uncertain. "A few moments ago I felt no anger toward you, no desire to prove my superiority, no need to defend my reputation. There was just two human beings moving together in a kind of dance. The victory feels less important than the discovery that conflict itself might be optional." Over the following months, this realization revolutionized not only Musashi's approach to swordsmanship, but his entire way of being in the world. He began to understand that the mindset that made him invincible in duels, the assumption that life was fundamentally about competing with and defeating others, was actually creating most of the conflicts he thought he was responding to. He started to notice how his warrior's vigilance made others defensive around him, how his strategic thinking turned simple conversations into contests, how his need to win created opponents even in situations where none needed to exist. The very skills that had made him a master of external combat were revealed to be obstacles to the inner peace he had never realized he was seeking. Musashi began studying with a Zen master named Takuan, not to improve his fighting techniques, but to understand the nature of the mind that either created conflict or could remain peaceful regardless of external circumstances. Under Takuan's guidance, he discovered that true strength came not from the ability to defeat others, but from the capacity to remain centered regardless of what others were doing. The supreme warrior, Takuan taught him, is one who can win without fighting, not because he avoids conflict, but because his presence itself creates harmony rather than discord. When you no longer need to prove anything to anyone, including yourself, you discover a power that makes physical strength irrelevant. This training required Musashi to develop completely different capacities than those he had cultivated as a duelist. Instead of practicing techniques for defeating opponents, he learned to cultivate states of mind that made opponents unnecessary. Instead of studying ways to create advantage in conflict, he explored how to respond to aggression in ways that transformed it into cooperation. The transformation was gradual but profound. Musashi began to notice that when he approached potential conflicts from a place of genuine curiosity rather than defensive strategy, most situations that might have escalated into confrontation naturally resolved into conversation. When he listened to criticism without immediately preparing his counterarguments, he often discovered valuable insights rather than attacks to be deflected. Most remarkably, he found that his actual fighting abilities improved dramatically as he became less attached to winning. When he sparred with students, his movements became more fluid and responsive because he wasn't trying to impose predetermined strategies on fluid situations. His technique became more effective because he was responding to what was actually happening rather than to what he expected or feared might happen. The way of the warrior, Musashi began teaching his students, is not about defeating enemies, but about transcending the mindset that creates enemies in the first place. True victory is not overcoming others, but overcoming the part of yourself that needs to fight. This approach attracted a completely different kind of student than had previously sought Musashi's instruction. Instead of ambitious young men seeking to become deadly fighters, he began drawing sincere seekers who wanted to understand how martial arts could serve peace rather than conflict. His dojo became known not for producing the most feared warriors, but for creating individuals who could maintain their center regardless of external pressures. Years later, when Musashi wrote his famous text, The Book of Five Rings, it contained insights that went far beyond sword technique. He wrote about the importance of developing no mind, a state of natural responsiveness that could meet any situation with appropriate action without being caught in preconceived strategies. He emphasized the value of what he called the void, the spacious awareness that could contain all possibilities without being limited by any particular approach. In the void, he wrote, there is good but no evil. There is wisdom, principle, and the way. In this void, you can see clearly what is true and what is false. The void is where nothing exists, but everything is possible. When you understand the void, you are no longer controlled by external circumstances because you have found the source of unshakable strength within your own being. Students who trained with the later Musashi often reported that sparring with him was like fighting with water. He seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, responding perfectly to their attacks, while never appearing to be in conflict with them. His technique had evolved beyond winning and losing into something that resembled a form of moving meditation. But perhaps the most profound change in Musashi was in his daily life outside the dojo. The hypervigilance that had once made simple activities exhausting was replaced by a natural alertness that enhanced rather than diminished his capacity for joy. He could appreciate beauty without calculating its strategic value, form friendships without wondering about their political implications, and experience simple pleasures without his warrior's mind, turning them into potential weaknesses to be guarded against. The samurai who had never lost a duel had finally discovered his most important victory: triumph over the part of himself that needed to win. In learning to conquer himself, he had found something far more valuable than invincibility. He had found peace. When students would ask Musashi about the secret of his transformation from deadly warrior to peaceful master, he would often demonstrate with a simple exercise. He would place 2 cups of water on a table and ask the student to engage in combat with one of them, to defeat it, to prove their superiority over it. After watching them struggle with the absurdity of fighting with an inanimate object, Musashi would ask gently, "What would happen if you approached other people the way you naturally approach this cup of water? Not as opponents to be defeated, but simply as fellow expressions of life to be met with natural responsiveness?" This became known as the teaching of the unconquerable cup, the recognition that our need to fight with life creates most of the resistance we encounter, and that true strength is found not in overcoming opposition, but in discovering the part of ourselves that doesn't create opposition in the first place. The warrior's path, Musashi had discovered, ultimately leads not to the ability to defeat others, but to the capacity to remain peaceful, regardless of what others choose to do. In conquering himself, he had found the only victory that truly matters: the triumph of wisdom over the compulsive patterns that create unnecessary suffering for ourselves and everyone around us. The cook who fed thousands with empty bowls. In the bustling monastery kitchens of Tashilhunpo, where the aroma of barley tea and roasted grain filled the air from before dawn until well after sunset, worked a cook named Pemba, whose simple approach to nourishment would reveal profound truths about the nature of true satisfaction. For 20 years, Pemba had prepared meals for the monastery's 300 monks, taking pride in creating dishes that were both nutritious and delicious, despite the simple ingredients available in their mountain location. His reputation for transforming humble barley, vegetables, and occasional dairy products into satisfying meals had made him beloved throughout the community. Monks would often comment that Pemba's cooking somehow left them feeling more deeply nourished than meals they remembered from their lives in the world, even when those had included far more elaborate and expensive ingredients. Yet Pemba himself remained puzzled by this phenomenon. Despite his skill and the appreciation he received, he often felt that something essential was missing from his understanding of what it truly meant to nourish others. He could create meals that satisfied hunger and pleased the palate, but he sensed there was a deeper dimension to nourishment that remained beyond his grasp. The revelation that would transform his entire approach to cooking began during what initially appeared to be a catastrophic failure. The monastery was preparing to host a gathering of senior lamas from across Tibet, an event that occurred only once every few years and required feeding nearly 800 people for 3 days. Pemba had spent weeks planning elaborate menus, calculating quantities, and organizing the logistics of such massive food preparation. On the morning the gathering was to begin, disaster struck. The caravan carrying the special ingredients Pemba had ordered for the occasion was delayed by an unexpected snowstorm in the mountain passes. The dried fruits, special spices, and imported delicacies that were meant to create memorable meals for the distinguished guests were trapped somewhere in the mountains, with no possibility of arrival for at least a week. Pemba stood in his kitchen, surrounded by only the most basic staples: barley flour, a small amount of vegetables, some butter, and tea. With 800 people arriving within hours, expecting meals worthy of such an important gathering, he felt overwhelmed by the impossibility of his situation. How could he create anything remotely adequate from such limited ingredients? It was then that the monastery's oldest resident, a monk named Lobsang, who had lived there for over 60 years, appeared in the kitchen doorway. At 93, Lobsang rarely left his simple quarters, spending most of his time in quiet meditation. His presence in the kitchen was so unusual that Pemba immediately stopped his anxious preparations. "Grandfather," Pemba said, using the term of respect reserved for the most elderly monks, "I fear I am about to bring shame upon our monastery. We have nothing to offer our distinguished guests but the most humble fare." Lobsang moved slowly into the kitchen, his ancient eyes taking in the modest ingredients laid out on the preparation tables. Instead of expressing concern or disappointment, his weathered face broke into a gentle smile. "Tell me, son," he said in a voice that carried the quiet authority of someone who had witnessed many decades of monastery life, "what is the most important ingredient in any meal you prepare?" Pemba looked around the kitchen, confused by what seemed like an irrelevant question given the urgency of his situation. "I suppose it depends on the dish, grandfather. For barley soup, the barley itself. For vegetable stew, the vegetables." "Look deeper," Lobsang said patiently. "What ingredient is present in every single meal you have ever prepared, regardless of what other components were available?" Pemba struggled with this riddle, his mind racing through years of cooking experience. What common element could possibly be found in every dish he had ever made? Water was essential for most preparations, but not all. Fire was necessary for cooking, but that wasn't an ingredient in the usual sense. I don't understand, grandfather. What ingredient could be present in everything? Lobsang's smile deepened as he gestured toward Pemba himself. Your attention, he said simply. Your presence. Your intention to nourish those who will receive what you create. In every meal you have ever prepared, the most essential ingredient has been your own awareness, your care, your wish for the well-being of others. This simple observation stopped Pemba completely. In all his years of focusing on recipes, techniques, and ingredients, he had never considered that his own state of mind might be the most crucial element in the nourishment he provided. But how can attention feed hungry people? Pemba asked, genuinely bewildered. How can presence satisfy physical appetite? Prepare your simplest meal, Lobsang said, settling himself on a cushion where he could observe the cooking process. But this time, instead of worrying about what attention to what you have, instead, you lack. Pay completed of focusing on impressing your guests. Focus on serving them. Instead of thinking about the outcome, be fully present with each step of the preparation. With no other options available, Pemba decided to follow this advice. He began preparing the most basic meal possible: simple barley porridge, steamed vegetables, and butter tea. But instead of his usual, efficient, somewhat distracted approach to routine cooking, he brought his complete attention to each element of the process. As he cleaned the barley grain by grain, removing stones and debris, he found himself appreciating the simple beauty of each kernel, the way they felt in his hands, the subtle variations in color and shape. When he lit the fire, instead of simply getting it hot enough for cooking, he attended to the flames themselves, their dance, their warmth, their transformation of wood into heat and light. Most remarkably, as he stirred the porridge, Pemba discovered that his usual mental commentary about the inadequacy of the meal began to quiet. In its place arose a natural gratitude for the grain that would nourish hundreds of people, for the water that made cooking possible, for the fire that would transform raw ingredients into digestible food. Something extraordinary began to happen in the kitchen. Other monks who came to help with the massive food preparation noticed an unusual quality in the atmosphere. Despite the simplicity of what was being prepared, there was a sense of abundance, of celebration, of profound care being woven into every aspect of the cooking process. When the first guests arrived and were served their humble meal of barley porridge and vegetables, something unprecedented occurred. Instead of the polite disappointment that might have been expected when distinguished visitors were offered such simple fare, there was an immediate sense of deep satisfaction that seemed to go far beyond what the basic ingredients could have provided. Conversations around the dining hall took on a quality of warmth and connection that even elaborate banquets rarely achieved. Guests lingered over their simple bowls, many commenting that they couldn't remember when a meal had left them feeling so completely nourished. Some of the senior lamas, accustomed to formal ceremonial meals, spoke quietly among themselves about the extraordinary sense of presence and care they could taste in every spoonful. As the 3-day gathering continued, with each meal consisting of the same simple ingredients prepared with the same quality of complete attention, something remarkable emerged. The event became legendary, not for its elaborate hospitality, but for the profound sense of spiritual nourishment that seemed to arise from the very simplicity and mindfulness of the food service. Years later, Lamas who had attended that gathering would speak of it as one of the most meaningful spiritual retreats of their lives. They would describe not just the teachings they had received in the formal sessions, but the teaching that seemed to be transmitted through the meals themselves, a wordless instruction about the transformative power of bringing complete presence to the most ordinary activities. As the first light of dawn touches the mountain peaks and our 3 hours of sacred storytelling draw to their gentle close, you carry within you now something far more valuable than any treasure merchants have ever transported across ancient trade routes. These Buddhist tales have worked their quiet magic, planting seeds of wisdom that will continue blooming long after these words fade into silence. Each story you've received tonight offers medicine for the modern soul, practical understanding that transforms how you meet tomorrow's challenges with the same natural ease that bamboo bends with mountain winds. The peace you've touched in these ancient teachings isn't something you've gained, but something you've remembered you never actually lost. Like the eternal flame that cannot truly be extinguished, your essential nature remains untouchable by any storm, unmarked by any failure, undiminished by any struggle. Rest now in the profound simplicity these masters have shared. That enlightenment isn't a distant achievement, but the natural recognition of what has always been present, waiting patiently beneath your thoughts like still water beneath passing clouds. Let these timeless wisdoms continue their silent work as you sleep, weaving themselves into the very fabric of your dreams, awakening you to the extraordinary peace that is your birthright.